Keir Starmer might have just been exposed for literally committing treason against the United Kingdom. Allegedly, I have to say. Don't send the police to arrest me, mate. Now, what exactly is going on? Well, this is all about the Chinese spy scandal that is now spiraling out of control, with Labour Party officials on the news, on the media, trying to do as much damage control as possible. But every day now, more evidence is mounting against the Labour Party, and some brilliant investigative work has been done by the Times that has all but proven, in my opinion, that Labour basically betrayed the British people in favour of literally Chinese communists. Now, it's almost certain at this point that Starmer, or at least one of his close allies, is directly accountable for this betrayal. So in this video, I'm going to do my best to explain everything that's happened, what's going on, and why I'm so firm in my belief that this really does amount to a complete betrayal of the British people and what just might end up happening next. So let's start off with some background of the scandal. In 2024, two men get charged, these two blokes here, Christopher Berry and Chris Cash, under the Official Secrets Act for offences of spying for China and giving China sensitive information. Now, the targets of this information given to China by these spies was surrounding members of parliament and policy material, so it is really quite an important issue if China is spying on our politicians. Now, just before the case went to trial, the prosecutors dropped the case and just let them off free and declared them not guilty, so those alleged spies wouldn't face any trial and punishment for their crimes if they committed them at all. Now, the Director of Public Prosecutions, he actually publicly came out and said the reason they had to drop the case was because the government refused to provide evidence that China was a national security threat, which apparently, according to the CPS, is a legal requirement for the charges to be laid against these people. Basically, the government had to say that China was legally a threat to the United Kingdom, and that means that spying for the Chinese is bad, and the government refused to do that. They refused to say that it's bad for someone to spy for literal Chinese communists. Now, this obviously got some negative attention, and some politicians come out and start talking about it, and the media jumps on top, realising that this is actually rather a big scandal. The Labour government refused to say that China, a literal genocidal communist country, is an enemy of the UK, and so we aren't able to stop people from spying against our own country and committing treason against us. Now, the Times then came out and announced and revealed that this didn't happen by accident, and it was almost certainly done on purpose. Here's a quote from the Times article: "A dossier of evidence from the security services showing that China was a threat to Britain's national security was not passed to prosecutors in China in the China spying case after Labour came to power, according to former ministers." So the government had a load of evidence, a dossier of evidence proving that China is a threat to us, and the Labour government refused to give that dossier to the prosecutors, so the prosecutors have no choice but to abandon the prosecution to let these people off free because they just can't act without it. So this included evidence of, and again I quote, hundreds of cyber attacks, intellectual property theft, theft to critical infrastructure, and secret police stations set up by China's spy agency Beijing in the UK to spy on dissidents from Hong Kong who are often British citizens. It even included bounties placed on dissidents' heads within our country. Then it gets revealed that the National Security Advisor, which is a political appointment made by Keir Starmer when he gained power, was this guy called Powell. It was revealed on Thursday that Powell had suppressed a Whitehall investigation into Chinese spying after lobbying by the Treasury. He was said to have censored details about Chinese espionage in the Foreign Office's China audit. So Powell is now being exposed for helping China spy on the United Kingdom by refusing to allow British authorities to check and find these spies and to stop it and to report it happening. And this all followed a meeting that Powell had with Chinese officials in London. Now, here is my absolute favourite quote from this entire article. A senior Whitehall source said that their understanding was that ministers had not been involved in the decision, that the failure of the case rested between the deep state and lawyers. So they're blaming the deep state and lawyers and saying it isn't the fault of Keir Starmer. Now, I wonder, who is the most famous lawyer in the country right now who worked for the state of the United Kingdom, perhaps even used to be the Director of Public Prosecutions, and now just so happens to run the entire state? Who would be a really, really good example of a deep state lawyer in the United Kingdom? Would it be perhaps lawyer and now Prime Minister Keir Starmer? I think it might be. Now, this is insane, and it seems pretty clear at this point that Labour are complicit in this and they have betrayed Britain and may even have committed treason against Britain. But what are their motivations behind this betrayal of Britain? Well, I think there's two. I think there's an economic and an investment-based one, and then an ideological one as well. Now, obviously, China's a big country, they're a big economy, lots of wealth, and they're very influential, and we import a lot of goods from China, and a huge amount of Chinese wealth is invested around the world, including in government debt here in the UK and within businesses and other things in the UK as well. Now, we don't know exactly how much government debt is owned by China, British government debt that is, but about 25% of our debt, our sovereign debt in general, is owned by foreign investors, so it's probably around something like 10%. Now the argument here, the economic one, the Starmer apologists and left-wingers are making, is that Labour don't want to label China an enemy because then the Chinese will stop investing in the UK and we lose loads of money because of that, so they're bending over backwards to keep China happy. Now, first of all, most of the Chinese who own British assets and debt, it's not the Chinese Communist Party itself, it's individuals or institutions, it's not the government, right? These people are far less likely to care about whether or not the CCP is labelled an enemy to Britain. And even if the CCP itself does start selling UK assets, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? One very simple core bad outcome is the impact to government bonds. If the CCP sells their government bonds, right, the supply increases, prices fall, yields rise, and our cost to service our government debt increases. That is bad, don't get me wrong. But you know what's actually good for the UK? It's Chinese investors or the Communist Party selling UK assets, buildings and businesses, because the price of those assets would decrease, but not the value. Right? Value is not price. Value is the intangible aspect of what it's actually worth. Price is what someone is paying for it currently. So British investors and British people could buy back British assets below their true market value, make a profit, and stop the UK from being asset stripped by literal communists. That's actually a very good thing. Now, I don't really think that's the true motivation for Labour doing this. I think actually it's ideological, right? The legacy media is ignoring this entirely, by the way. They're acting like it's just a conspiracy theory, not worthy of mention, but the Labour Party is an overtly socialist party. It has been written into their DNA for 100 years, and it was only removed from their official policy by Blair, but it's still completely dominated by two main overarching goals. They make the state bigger, they tax more and they spend more, and they increase control, facial recognition, more CCTV, violations of free speech, put in place digital ID. Everything Labour do leads to one of those two things, the state getting bigger or the state getting more powerful, and the ability of the state to attack and to clamp down on their opponents as well. Now, what is perhaps the most technologically advanced authoritarian country in the world? Well, of course, it's communist China. These socialists within Labour, they admire China and they dream of ending up like them. And it's no coincidence that China are building the biggest super embassy in the world in the UK right now, that it will basically be a legally immune and protected spy base for China to subvert all of us within the UK, and Labour support it being built. It's no surprise that Labour don't protect Chinese dissidents when they're spied on by Chinese spies in our country, because they wish they could do that themselves, but sadly at the moment, for them, they can't. Labour is also jam-packed with members of the Fabian Society. Speaking of which, I've been meaning to make a video explaining the Fabian Society and exposing it all for what it really is. So if you want to see that, leave a comment down below letting me know and I'll try and get round to it if enough people want it. But the Fabian Society, in short, is an organisation that expressly admits its aims are to slowly and silently drag the UK into socialism, because if they did it publicly, vocally, then democracy and the British people would oppose it and stop it from happening. Right? Their stated aim is to trick the British people into voting for socialism. Right? Their logo was literally a wolf in sheep's clothing for 100 years. Keir Starmer is a member of the Fabian Society, not a conspiracy theory, 100% fact. He admits it clearly. He's written articles for the Fabian Society in the past as well, along with almost every single ally of his and almost everyone in the Labour Party. Now, the ideological argument for why Labour betrayed Britain is to help the Chinese communists, and it's actually very simple, right? They wish the UK was ruled by socialists like the CCP rule in China. Now, getting past that, is this scandal real? Are Labour really behind the failure of this prosecution? Have they actually sided with literal communists in China against their own country? The truth is, we don't actually know yet for sure, but my hunch is that yes, this scandal is all true. And currently it's all allegedly, but it seems almost certain to be true at this point. Labour most likely did purposely destroy the prosecution, specifically to hurt the UK and to aid China. Why am I so firm in this belief? Well, two reasons, actually. The main one, actually, funnily, from LBC, which is usually a relatively biased in favour of the left media organisation, but Starmer is so unpopular, even they can't play cover for Labour for this. Now, LBC recently interviewed the Labour MP and Cabinet Minister Bridget Phillipson specifically about this scandal, and here's exactly what she said.
Can you give us your assurance that the Prime Minister, and no one who works for the Prime Minister, and in this you'll know I'm referring to his National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell, were in any way involved with this decision?
I can give you the assurance that the National Security Advisor was not involved in discussions about the substance of the case or about the evidence connected to the case, yes.
Was he involved in any way?
No, he was not involved in this case, either on the substance or the evidence. I can give you that assurance.
He was not consulted, and he didn't give his view about any of it at any point?
Well, I'm sure he has opinions on lots of topics.
No, but he wasn't consulted and he didn't give a view.
He was not involved in the evidence or in the taking forward of this case. He was not involved in the substance of it. It is deeply frustrating, deeply disappointing.
What does it mean that he wasn't involved in the substance? What do you mean by that?
He was not involved in the substance of this case in material considerations, including considerations in relation to the evidence. I'm trying to be as clear as I possibly can that this is fundamentally a matter for the Crown Prosecution Service. And yes, we are frustrated too that the cases were not taken forward.
So was the Prime Minister or anyone who works for the Prime Minister involved in this decision? This is what she said. I can give you the assurance that the National Security Advisor was not involved in discussions about the substance of the case or about the evidence connected to the case. Was he involved in any way? He was not involved in the substance or the evidence. What does it mean he was not involved in the substance? He was not involved in the substance of this case in material considerations, including considerations in relation to the evidence. What the fuck does the substance mean, right? My interpretation is that there's no concrete evidence where the National Security Advisor actively told the CPS to drop the case, and there is probably evidence that might emerge of him saying he thinks they should drop the case or something like that, but not an actual command. Now, the second thing is that this is a total failure by LBC here to dig deeper on Starmer as well. The first question was the PM or anyone who worked with him involved? The answer just ignores Starmer altogether, doesn't address that whatsoever, and neither do any of the follow-ups. So that is just, left to go. But an example of just how ridiculous this is, Lord Chris Patten, who was the last governor of Hong Kong before it was given back to Communist China, obviously he has loads of experience in diplomatic relations with China. He came on LBC as well, and here's what he had to say about this scandal and that interview clip that we just watched as well.
So when the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, when she told me this morning, I repeatedly asked her whether or not Jonathan Powell was involved with not choosing to designate China a national security threat, and she kept saying he was not involved in the material considerations in relation to the evidence of the case. What do you think that means?
Was that worked out by her lawyer? What did she say?
It sounds like it's been worked out by her lawyer. It's clear as day, really, this, isn't it? It's so damn obvious. A lawyer looked through all of the evidence and decided that this is the closest thing they can say to get to denying the allegations. Not involved in the substance of the case in material consideration in relation to the evidence. That doesn't mean he hasn't spoken about it. That doesn't mean he hasn't given his opinion about it. That doesn't mean anything that I can really decipher. It's just, utter politics speak, right? Now, Labour know they have a leaky organisation. Starmer's been having his allies attacked and these leaks coming out for months, and it causes a scandal like Rayner dodging tax or Mandelson being best friends with a paedophile. Then they resign or they get fired and Starmer loses an ally. Labour almost certainly know that more information here is going to get leaked, so they're planning around the leak that they know is coming. And this line from Labour won't technically be a lie, right? Because a lawyer looked over it and made sure it was technically truthful. But if Starmer and his team had actually not been involved in this scandal, they would just say that up front. They would just say, no, Starmer isn't involved, Powell isn't involved at all, this is all nonsense and not an issue. We'll release all the files and data and correspondence to prove that it's not an issue. This kind of legalese, the specificity of what they're saying, whilst not clarifying anything, only goes to destroy their credibility and make it so clear that actually they are complicit in this. And it's only a matter of time until this escalates and it gets way worse. So what's likely to come next from all of this? whose political career is going to die, and what should we actually hope to happen? Well, first of all, I don't think this is going to kill Starmer's career, right? He's survived 10 big scandals at this point. Yes, the polls get worse every day. Yes, he has zero chance of winning an election right now, but with such a large majority in the Commons, he doesn't really need to worry about any of that. He literally also just fought off a coup against Labour Party members and probably the most electable Labour Party member in the country. It's clear that Labour don't really have the appetite or a good enough replacement to warrant getting rid of Starmer right now, and it's clear that Starmer thinks his unpopularity is just a product of the tough times he inherited from the Tories and nothing to do with him just being unlikable and an awful person. He wants to remain as Prime Minister. He doesn't care about succeeding as Prime Minister. He just wants to go down in history as a Prime Minister and remain in control for as long as possible. Now, the only reason that this might cause Starmer to resign as Prime Minister is if loads of Labour MPs decided this betrayal was so awful he had to go and they start a revolt against him. But the problem here, most Labour MPs aren't actually patriotic, right? They don't actually care about the country. And again, they care about themselves and advancing socialism, not the United Kingdom. So betraying the country in aid of a foreign socialist regime, a communist regime, that's not actually a big deal to them. So incredibly, it's very unlikely, I think, that this does cause Starmer to resign or get ousted. The only real exception to this, in my opinion, is if more evidence comes out and it indicates that Starmer himself is so implicated in a crazy way, and it literally proves he committed an active crime or literal treason against the UK, then he would have no chance in hell of staying on and would have to resign, right? We then see a new Labour Party election to decide its leader and the next Prime Minister. The good news, if that happens, the most charismatic Labour contender who has the best chance of winning an election is Andy Burnham. He's not even an MP right now, so he wouldn't even be eligible to run for party leader and Prime Minister. Instead, we'd end up with someone useless and uncharismatic like Rachel Reeves or David Lammy, and Labour would still get trounced in the next election, and we can undo all of the harm that Labour has forced upon us. Now, if Starmer doesn't get criminally implicated and he remains in power, well, he's still hated across the entire country, right? Labour still has horrible polling, getting worse every week. Starmer still lacks any charisma or relatability, and so will always struggle to be popular. And as a result, Labour still get ruined and trounced at the next election, and Reform come into power and we can finally start fixing our country again. Someone almost certainly is going to go here, though. It could be Lord Hermer, right? He's already had a bunch of scandals, and I'm sure he's related to this in some way, right? He refused to authorise the prosecution of NECAP for supporting a terror group until the day after the 6-month deadline, so the case fell apart. He's reported to have been very, very close friends with the lawyers litigating against the UK government and the Chagos deal, and has basically thrown the UK under the bus. And now he's caught up in this a little bit as well. Already a very deeply unpopular man. There's a decent chance he ends up dirty after this too dirty and has to resign. And obviously, the other main contender for who's going to get the sack or be forced to resign here is Jonathan Powell, right? The National Security Advisor appointed by Starmer when he came into power. He was Tony Blair's Chief of Staff before, right? He's almost certainly directly responsible for this scandal, so there's a good chance he gets the boot here. Now, all in all, I want to be clear. This is a bad situation, right? Our national security is genuinely being threatened by the Chinese Communist Party. China will be influenced to increase their spying against us because of Labour's weakness in this case, and our vulnerability to Chinese financial warfare is real and not ignorable in my opinion. But only for the short term is this really a bad thing, because in the long run, a scandal like this just shows even more voters how awful Labour is. It tanks their polling even further, and it makes them even less likely to stay in government in the future. So actually, there is a little bit of a silver lining here. The chance of a Reform government in 2029 just got a little bit more likely.